Well, well, good
Hi.
morning, everybody. I'm glad to have y'all here. Glad to be back. Today, what I wanted to talk about was a history of the Civil War battles at Fort Fisher. Now, while I'm going to talk a little bit about the battles, what I'm mainly interested in doing is setting the stage as to why the struggle for Fort Fisher was so important to United States history and what it means to not only North Carolinians, but Americans around the country and to people outside the United States, and why this was a very, very major operation that people took interest in. So, what I will do is I will go into this afterwards. I'll be willing to take any questions. And so we'll see how this works out. Now, to understand why Fort Fisher was important, you actually have to know why Wilmington was important. From its very nature, between the 1840s and 1860s, Wilmington explodes as a population center. It is the largest city in North Carolina by 1860. In fact, it's so large that it is the 100th largest city in the United States, according to the 1860 census. Now, to put that in perspective, Atlanta, Georgia, which has movies and books and all kinds of things about its Civil War heritage, was number 99 in the country, only by two people. So Wilmington was pretty populous at that time. It was also a very diverse city. In 1860, your population white was about 48%. Your population African was about 47%. That left the other percentage as mixed race, and free. And so what you have is a very balanced city, which is unheard of in the American South. And so while you have 10,000 people, you have 4,500 white, 4,500 black, and then the rest are either mixed or freed Africans. And so Wilmington was really a major hub for anything going on at this time. And so that really gave Wilmington such an importance in the South. The other reason it was so important was you had the Cape Fear River that brought ships to the port of Wilmington. You had three railroads that actually left Wilmington and went elsewhere. The Wilmington and Weldon was a north running train. You had the Wilmington and Manchester, which ran west to um, really to Florence, South Carolina. And then you had a third that ran to Laurinburg and up to Charlotte. So you really had connections anywhere in the state and the country through the port of Wilmington. And that made it very important. So you actually can see by the lines here are three different railroads, even though two are on the map. And that meant that as this town developed over the 1840s and into the 1860s, it really got an international flavor to it. And so that's why you had this diversity of the background of everybody in this town. It was mainly a international trading port. It was the largest, deepest port in North Carolina, and it really played its role. Now, that also meant that you had people making tons of money, just like this house that's in downtown Wilmington. You had all types of money being made, and you even had some of this money turned back into the community where they started making their very own banks. And so what you have is really a microcosm of what's going on in the American South and in throughout the country. Interestingly enough, Wilmington, North Carolina, was not very secession oriented. They did not want to leave the Union. Why? Because they were making such money off northern shipping, getting cotton to the northern mills, actually dealing with international trade, that they did not want to secede from the federal union. And it will not be until the very end, the last minute, when it starts to get into March, April, and May of 1861, that the really big hothead secessionists really take hold of Wilmington society. Up until that point, it really is a very supportive country or supportive area to the United States Constitution and staying a member of the Union. Now, once Wilmington actually leaves and North Carolina is the last state to join the Southern Confederacy, the whole idea of how do you bring the nation back together was thought of as the Anaconda Plan, which was thought of as General Winfield Scott. What he wanted to do was to not physically fight the South, but he wanted to constrict the South by taking away all of its ability to do trade outside of its own self. And the thought was that this is going to be a bloodless fight, that by restricting the ability of the South to have imports and exports, they would finally come to their senses and actually return to the Union. But not everybody wanted to do that. In an attempt to make sure that the South would stay viable by itself, a lot of shipbuilding companies in England and Scotland and Ireland actually started developing these specialized ships known as blockade runners. And these were shallow draft vessels that could actually speed through the water faster than any Navy ship, had large cargo holds and very daring crews to bring materials into this place. With this creation of that blockade running in these specialized ships, the United States Navy knew it had to blockade this whole area. And so Wilmington really becomes a target to try to close off this commerce and trade going on with overseas businesses. Now, during this time, as this is happening, Fort Fisher, which had been built down here at New Inlet, was really trying to be created to defend that area and allow these ships to come in. That is because, let me show you, if you can see my cursor right where it says Atlantic Ocean, that's where the channel actually ran in front of Fort Fisher. That's why the sea face of this whole area was so long. What you're looking at from this point right here, where the Northeast Bastion is, which is about right where the current day museum where I'm sitting today is, all the way down to this location called the Mound Battery, which is where the North Carolina Aquarium is about 3/4 of a mile. And so it's a very long sea face. That's because ships would actually have to cross right in front of that Atlantic Ocean. So to try to make sure that this was happening, Confederate forces in North Carolina brought men from the surrounding counties to garrison this fortification. One of these gentlemen was Sergeant Thaddeus C. Davis, who you actually see there. He enlisted in October 1861, is in one of the garrison, with the 40th North Carolina, which is an artillery unit. He is posted about right where his photograph is done or showing, which is up in the Shepherd's Battery area. Attached to him are all kinds of individuals, young and old. And one of those is Private Thomas Hildreth, who enlists at age 43. He is a veteran of the Mexican-American War and is actually trying to just do what he's been drafted to do. Now, not everybody went to Fort Fisher to serve willingly. Part of the fort was actually built in 1863 and 1864 by conscription. That means that they were bringing people down here against their will to actually build this fortification. Who were they bringing? Well, these were slaves from around the state and also freedmen who were also being brought in as well. That also meant that even as far west as Lumberton, they were bringing in the Lumbee Indians and conscription to actually build this fortification as well. And so the thought was that they were going to try to build this up as fast as possible. And so that's one of the stories that we've actually just come across within the last 10 years. We've known that this was there. We've just been able to find all the documents now. Well, this fort was pretty impressive when it was actually built. It was thought of as a psychological impression to try to actually make this happen. And so in 1864, with everything going on around the country, with the war actually being fought, Fort Fisher's role really became very important in protection of that blockade running idea. Now, in the fall of 1864, you actually have an amazing thing occurring. You actually have a political election for president occurring during a civil war. Now, these generally do not happen. They are generally one rule: whoever is in power when the Civil War starts continues ruling until the war comes to a conclusion. But in November 1864, the Northern Democrats put forward General George B. McClellan as their candidate, who was willing to sue for peace at any cost. His job was to bring the war to a close. Regardless of what happened, everything would go back to the way it was pre 1861, and that was what they wanted. On the other hand, you had the Republican Party, who was pushing Abraham Lincoln, and Lincoln wanted to make sure that this war actually meant something. That nearly by the end of it, nearly 750,000 people would be dead from this. Soldiers, civilians, just devastation throughout parts of the country. And so he wanted to make sure that this actually meant something. Now, the problem was that you had Democrats that were really saying, look, Lincoln can't do this job. He has no idea what he's doing. He's actually caused this issue. So what we need to do is you need to sue for peace. We just need to call it over. It's over and done with. There's no problem with actually giving in to what Southern demands are. And so what they would do to represent themselves, they were called the Copperheads, and they would take the pennies and they would snip the heads of Abraham Lincoln off those pennies. So you would be recognized as a Copperhead. Now, unfortunately, the war had come to a stalemate everywhere else around the country. So you have the issue of your Union soldiers actually having a problem outside Virginia. You have them stalemated outside in Georgia, and they're trying to do this election. Well, Lincoln really counted on the soldiers trying to pull across his election. Well, what had happened was, since General McClellan was the Democratic candidate, the Democrats were hoping that because they were using a general that people liked, that he would actually gain this election for them. Unfortunately for them, with this stalemate going on and these guys really wanting to know that their friends and the people they had grown up with have died for something, they really actually turned to Lincoln as the victor of the political fight, as you will. With this whole olive branch and peace that would bring Union back, a lot of the soldiers said, I didn't fight so that we could retain what happened in 1861 or what the country looked like prior to 1860. We fought this for a reason. And that's what really throws the election to Lincoln and the Republicans. It wasn't the fact that the country was tired of war. They wanted an outcome. They wanted something that they could say, we made sure this happened. And so to do that, in December of 1864, High Command, which was basically Abraham Lincoln and General Grant, decided that what they needed to do was they needed to get away from the stalemate and they needed to stop the Confederacy from fighting. Well, how do you do that? Well, you take away their ability to bring in supplies from all over the country. And this was what they decided to do. They decided to bring individuals together. And in this case, the High Command decided that what they would do is they would have Sherman marching through Georgia and South Carolina to eventually meet up with Grant. They would have Grant pushing through to make sure that they could all merge somewhere in North Carolina. Well, the first thing they decided to do was that Fort Fisher needed to fall to close off the port of Wilmington. And how do you do that? Well, they started trying to fish around for ideas, and they came up with this idea that if they put 200 tons of black powder on a ship and floated it right next to the fort, when it exploded, it would literally blow the fort to smithereens. That's because the fort was actually seen as built out of sand. When the troops actually arrived and they brought this boat in, nobody knew what the currents were going to do in the area. And so The ship actually floated a little bit out to shore. When it exploded, nothing happened. So on Christmas Day, 1864, Union Army forces actually landed north of Fort Fisher, and just a little south in between Curry Beach and Carolina Beach, with an attempt to actually try to take Fort Fisher. Now, the problem was is that the leadership of the Army actually stayed on board the transports. They never came off on shore. There was no supplies coming in. Nobody really had a plan as to what was going to happen. And so there's a major issue when they run up against the fort and they realize the Navy hasn't done its job by bombarding the fort. The powder boat didn't do any damage to this fortification. And so the high command calls for a retreat. And so everybody who had just been put on shore now has to get back on boats and go away. And so this really causes a big problem for Lincoln and for Grant in December of 1864. Because of the failure of this attack, it really puts into conditions what's happening at this fortification. While the country really wants a concrete solution to this secession movement, they also need to make sure that when the opportunity arises, that opportunity is taken. So in January 1864, they come up with a new plan. They come up with a new commander. And what they're going to do is they're going to take the Navy, who's already outside of Fort Fisher. They're going to take Union troops. They're going to start gathering any kind of troops that they possibly can to create what they call a Provisional Army Corps. This is a group that is actually just thrown together. It doesn't matter what unit you're with, you're just going to be thrown together and sent to Fort Fisher. Amazingly, out of this group is about 40% of the troops that make up this federal force are going to be from the Army of the James, which is the 24th Army Corps. Now, these are probably 80% freed Africans or escaped Africans who had left many of their plantation homes in the South, mainly Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. And these gentlemen are going to take the Union Blue and they are going to come back to Fort Fisher and to the Wilmington area and fight for the freedom of not only themselves, but for the freedom of their people. These gentlemen are also going to be hearing rumors that if they're caught, they're going to be immediately executed. And one of the things that will happen is they will take no prisoners. They realize that this is sort of a kill or be killed operation, and this is what they're going to do. For some of the men that are part of this I guess, fighting, like Bruce Anderson, he's going to be very interesting. Now, Anderson is listed as a mulatto, which means he's a mixed race individual. Interestingly enough, right after the war, he will change his racial status to Black, which is kind of interesting. Anderson, from what we can best understand, was born of parents that escaped slavery in Texas. They made it to Mexico, where he was born in Mexico City. And some point by 1863, 1864, he immigrates to the United States and becomes a farmhand in upstate New York. Now, in September 1864, he is drafted. September 1st, he signs his papers. He does not speak English, does not read English. And we know this because when he goes to sign the papers of enlistment, he actually just makes an X, and that was an indication that he could neither read nor write. So as it said in the paperwork, he made his mark, and that was just the X. So someone had to witness him making that mark. Interestingly enough, that means that he is going to have about 3 weeks of intensive training as a soldier before he actually goes down. Yes, ma'am. Gwendolyn, you had a question? I don't know if I can get you off mute.
Yes. Now, Bruce Anderson.
Yes, ma'am.
Was he mixed with Was he mixed with Mexican? Was he Mexican or black?
We don't know. We don't know much about his time in Mexico. The fact that he spoke Spanish fluently and came up, he was dark skinned, but apparently he seemed light skinned enough where he could pass for either Mexican, white, or black. So we're not really sure.
Okay.
This is the only known picture that we have of Bruce Anderson, which it's hard to tell even in this photograph.
Right. Right.
But we do know he came from Mexico. We think that his parents escaped slavery in Texas, and he immigrates up here. Now, interestingly enough, while he does sort of change his race on the census after the war, as a African man, this is very odd that he actually goes to enlist in an all-white regiment. This was unheard of. So he is a black man serving as a soldier in an all-white regiment, which is pretty incredible. And we'll come back to talk a little bit about Bruce Anderson in just a little bit more. But his is a kind of an interesting story. He's one of my most favorite stories here at Fort Fisher because it's so unique. Okay. We also have gentlemen such as William Freeman, who is a Medal of Honor recipient from the battles here. We have his Medal of Honor here on display. It's rare that you find these medals in other museums, but we actually have his. The family donated his to us. Bruce Anderson's we actually had for a while, but we sent it back to the family so they could hang on to it for us. In addition, you also had other men who were coming in who had been doing other things. Now, this is the last guy on the left is Sergeant Longshaw. Now, officers were not legal for receiving the Medal of Honor for actions. Longshaw, which is pretty rare, is supposed to go on vacation. He's been given leave on starting January 25th, 1865, which is the day of the attack on Fort Fisher. He was supposed to go home and visit his family. So instead of going home to visit his family, he actually says, I'm going to wait another day. I'm going to take part in the attack and then I'll go on leave. Longshaw will actually be a part of the landing party. Now, normally you do not find doctors and medics in the actual attacking fort. They're usually about a mile or so behind the lines. And so this was pretty amazing that this guy would actually refuse to go on leave when he was supposed to, and would actually be carrying his medical bag while everybody around him has pistols and swords and rifles. He's doing nothing but carrying his medical bag forward. Right now, on January 13th, 1865, you had the forces for the Confederacy that were run by Braxton Bragg, who was not a very good guy to begin with. Probably he was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. He just doesn't seem to be all there. When Fort Fisher requests reinforcements, he never sends them. And so literally he sacrifices the fort to be able to hang on to his people. Now, this is a sideways view of the area. And so you've got Fort Fisher down here at this peninsula point. And then you've got a whole bunch of batteries on the other side. And so what will happen is federal troops will come ashore, and their plan of attack is different than they did in December of 1864. What they want to do is a two-pronged attack, which is to send the Navy as a landing force along the ocean face, along the ocean shore to cut around the Northeast Bastion. And then you're going to have the Federal Army coming down from the riverside. So literally, these two groups would actually meet behind the fort and thereby cut off all Confederate resistance at this time. It was a bold strike, and if both sides launched at the same time, this would overwhelm Confederate forces. Unfortunately, they did not last. They did not launch at the same time. When the signal was given, the Union Navy and Marine Corps forces actually started running towards the fort, the Army was still trying to get itself under control and trying to figure out what they're going to do. Now, for the Navy personnel, you've got Seaman Bass on the left and Sergeant Richard Bender on the right, who were Medal of Honor recipients with this Navy attack. Now, the Navy has never been off the ships in almost 2 years, and their job is to take a pistol and a sword, which works if you're about 25 feet from you. But they're supposed to run 600 yards in wide open terrain in front of the entirety of the fort. And then they're supposed to attack that area that has the red blocks in it. And they're supposed to be successful. The problem was this was never practiced. This was never trained for. In fact, they only had about 3 hours to prepare for this attack. And so it fails miserably. Of the 2,100 Navy personnel, that's Marines and Navy personnel who were part of this attack, about 350 will be left dead and dying on the beaches in front of Fort Fisher. And so it's a dismal failure. And it really is something that shocks the Navy to the extreme that they blame the Marine Corps for the failure of this attack. And so that comes back to bite the Marine Corps later on. But the nice thing about the Marine Corps is they use this failure to actually adjust what their job is. Prior to the American Civil War, their only job was to protect the officers of the ship from mutinies. After the American Civil War, they've learned the lesson of Fort Fisher, and they actually learned to become a operational force going from ship to shore and actually capturing territories for the United States. So it really changes how they do things. Now, the federal troops, or when these guys start attacking, what you actually have here is the Marines were actually supposed to crawl forward using weapons to keep the Confederate heads, sharpshooters, down behind the fortification walls as everybody got closer. Unfortunately, because of the firing and because they really didn't know what they were going into for an attack, they really had a problem with this attack. And so it really fails. Yes, ma'am, Ms. Bowden? Do you have a question? Oh, you're on mute.
Okay. We used to go there as children in the long part called the Rocks.
Yes.
How did they get built and why were they built?
Well, the rocks were built well after the war was over. It was built because New Inlet, why Fort Fisher was there, was allowing a whole bunch of dirt and silt to come into the Cape Fear River. And it was causing the channel to stop up. So ships couldn't get to the port of Wilmington. So the rocks were built in 1881 to actually keep the ocean from closing up the shipping channel and allowing the port of Wilmington to stay. And so starting in 1881, they dropped a whole bunch of rocks that actually tried to filter out a lot of the sand. It wasn't being very effective. And then they poured a concrete shell over it about the turn of the century, turn of the 20th century. And that actually stopped all the sand from getting into the Cape Fear River and closing off the shipping channel. And that was the whole purpose of it.
Well, you know what? I was told something totally different as a child. We were told that the rocks were built by slaves to keep the Union Army from getting into Fort Fisher. And I guess that was wrong, but this
well, the rocks were built well after the war. Now, I will say that there is some truth to your story, because there were a lot of obstructions, mines, posts that were in the river to stop ships from coming up and down that river if they didn't know where they were. So I would say yes, that the slaves were used to build those obstructions in the river during the warfare. This was the most heavily defended river in the entire United States.
Really?
During the war. It was more heavily defended than any other river in North or South. So I would not be surprised if that was the case. So
John?
you're truth to it.
Are those obstructions still in the river?
They are not. They were taking out during the 1880s and right after the war. A lot of those were removed. During January and February 1865, as Union Navy ships were moving north towards Wilmington, they would stop and start pulling the mines and all these posts and all these obstructions out of the river. The hope was that once the battle came to an end, once Wilmington had been captured, it would become a Union supply base. And that way they could actually funnel federal troops into the center part of North Carolina, up to Fayetteville. So you had one group at New Bern, their job was to go to Goldsboro. The Wilmington group would go to Fayetteville, and then Sherman would capture Charlotte. And by that time, most North Carolina would have been captured or destroyed. And that would have ended pretty much the war. So now on the other side of the area, you actually have the United States Army attacking, and that's on the river side where you have Ames divisions and your federal infantry. The plan was that you would have 3 brigades attacking at different points. To do that, what they would also, they would send generals ahead of this army to attack those wooden fences. Now, interestingly enough, as I had mentioned earlier, that this was seen as an international event. This drawing that you're looking at actually came from a French newspaper, February 28th, 1865. So if you were sitting in a cafe in Paris, France in February 1865, and you opened up the newspaper, this is the report that you would see about the fighting at Fort Fisher, which was pretty amazing that this would happen. Now, of interest to the picture are people that are around that wooden fence line. As you see, there's some guys with axes chopping their fence down. I like this picture because this is the only one that really shows the axemen at work doing this job. Now, as I'd mentioned Bruce Anderson before, Anderson and 15 other men volunteer to do that job. They are going to drop their rifles, they're going to drop their packs. Their job is to run out in front of the whole federal attack, in front of the whole view of the fortification, armed only with nothing more than an axe. And their job is to chop down those wooden palisades to allow the soldiers to come in after them. And so what I like to do is I like to look, there's like 4 or 5 guys that are here with axes that you can see. I like to think one of those guys is Bruce Anderson, who was out there chopping down that fence. Now, of the 16 men who are volunteers for this activity, 1 will be killed January 15th. 2 will die later of their wounds received during this battle. 1 will die in April of 1865 in the hospital here at Wilmington. And then the other 12 will actually make it through the rest of the war and will actually survive. Now, all 16 men will be nominated and approved for the Medal of Honor because of their actions. That makes Bruce Anderson one of only 25 Africans who will be awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions during the American Civil War. So Fort Fisher is very honored to have Bruce Anderson as one of those very rare individuals who was awarded a Medal of Honor, who was African during that war. Now, the issue was you had to be alive to receive your Medal of Honor. Now, while the paperwork had been pushed through by their commanders, at some point in January 1865, the paperwork gets lost. And so Bruce Anderson will not receive his Medal of Honor until nearly 50 years to the day after this action, where the Army will finally realize they've discovered the paperwork, and he's presented with his Medal of Honor. In fact, the one photograph that we have, excuse me, backwards, let's see if I can find him. Yep, There it is. This one picture of Bruce Anderson up here, he's actually got his Medal of Honor pinned to his chest. And this was taken in 1915 when he had received it, and he wore it every day that he possibly could. So, which was pretty amazing. With the Army attack, it actually breaks through at Shepherd's Battery, thanks to these guys who are chopping down this wooden fence. They will come through, and now you actually have a Confederate counterattack. Both of the Confederate commanders are wounded during this fighting, and so this bloody hand-to-hand struggle really ensues along the land face. What will happen is this Confederate counterattack really has no push to it once Whiting and Lamb are wounded, and Union forces are able to push Confederates completely out of the fort. They will then start chasing them all the way down through the Northeast Bastion and further south until they finally get to the little area called Battery Buchanan, right there at the tip of where the rocks start. So if you want to know where the rocks start, that's Battery Buchanan. Now, right where the wharf is, you see a little indentation in the river. That's where the North Carolina ferry is located at Fort Fisher. And so that was a natural area for them to bring supplies into the fort. Well, now the North Carolina ferry just uses it as its area to bring the car trucks in. By the night of January 15th, Confederate forces, realizing they have nowhere else to go, federal reinforcements of the USCTs, or United States Colored Troops, which is what African troops were called during the Civil War, are in the advance of this. And so the surrender occurs with Confederate forces surrendering to Abbott's brigade of United States Colored Troops, thereby bringing a close to the battle. When the battle comes to an end, this is a great victory for federal troops. And so the whole entire Navy, who has rockets on board ships to send up signal flares, they start firing all these rockets into the air, and they've got multiple colored patterns. And so it's called a great pyrotechnic display. And they start celebrating the victory. Now, Confederate forces anywhere near Fort Fisher are seeing these massive colors going off in the sky, the explosions. They realize something big has happened. And for these individuals, this was a major occurrence. News will spread far and wide throughout the entire United States that Fort Fisher has fallen. When that happens, this is something that people will just say, wow, you went to Fort Fisher and you survived. It'd be like finding a veteran today who had survived landing on Omaha Beach, a Marine who survived the battle at Khe Sanh in Vietnam, or even a Marine who had survived the Second Battle of Fallujah. This is something that people hold in very high esteem, and it basically just goes off the radar by the 1890s, because this is more of a modern warfare battle. You have naval support, you actually have attacking a fixed fortified position, you have communication issues, you have leadership issues. This really models more of what you see during World War II in the Pacific, with the attacking of island after island after island by Marines and Army personnel. So, but this was a major blow to the Confederacy. With the fall of Fort Fisher, you really have an aftermath that comes to this. And the aftermath here is that a month after the fall of Fort Fisher, federal troops on the east side of the Cape Fear River, led by these African soldiers, march into Wilmington on the 21st of February, accepting the capture of the city of Wilmington. And as this drawing from the time period shows, that many of these soldiers came home to find their families waiting for them. And this was a way for the families to be reunited. These gentlemen had escaped the bondage of slavery and had come back wearing Union blue to free their families from what was going on. Now, for those Confederate forces, they are going to be sent to POW camps. As they are seen as traitors, they're really not going to be taken care of, nor are they going to be cared about. These guys from coastal North Carolina are going to be sent to Elmira, New York, about 55% of them will go to Elmira, New York. When they arrive at Elmira, New York in January 1865, there's 3 to 4 feet of snow on the ground. They're wearing whatever they were wearing in North Carolina, which is not very warm natured. And so by the time the war comes to an end in April, May of 1865, nearly 50% of the Confederate captures from Fort Fisher will die in captivity, either in Elmira, New York, or actually Point Lookout, Maryland. And this is pretty massive. For Sergeant Davis, who we had shown you a picture of earlier, who had enlisted in 1861, he is captured at Fort Fisher. He will actually survive the war. Now, interestingly enough about Davis, his wife was actually right across the river watching the battle on January 15th. That was a Sunday. While everybody was in Wilmington at church, she and a couple of other women came down the Cape Fear River and were watching the battle from directly across the river until, as she said, the darkness took her sight from her eyes. She never knew her husband had survived the battle on January 15th. That was until July of 1865 when he came walking in the door. She had no communication. There was no Red Cross. There was no communication north or south to say who survived and who did not. She had no idea if her husband had even survived the battle. Now, interestingly enough, the other person that was with him, Private Hildreth, who was the Mexican War veteran, he will get up to New York and he will die within a couple of weeks from pneumonia and will be buried in Elmira, New York at the Prisoner of War Cemetery. He is still resting up in New York. There is a massive cemetery for where the POW camp was, and that cemetery is still there as a national cemetery. Of the almost 12,000 Confederate soldiers, only about half of them will die in that captivity, and that will be a major issue. Now, as we talked about, why was this important? One of the things that was so important, and it shows in this scene, was Lincoln needed to have a reason why this battle had to keep going on. The Democrat Party wanted to sue for peace. The Republican says we need to make this war mean something. And it's this picture that really illustrates what Lincoln needed to have happen at Fort Fisher. And in this case, with the fall of Fort Fisher, he has the political power backed up by military victory to push through in January 1865, the 13th Amendment, which outlaws slavery. And had Fort Fisher not fallen, and Lincoln is putting so much pressure on Grant to make sure that this thing works and that Fort Fisher falls and Wilmington is captured, that this was the whole impetus as to why this battle had to happen in January 1865. With this political pressure on the military to produce a victory, to provide Lincoln the push in Congress to make sure that the 13th Amendment would actually be passed. And that's what Fort Fisher means to this country, is that without the fall of Fort Fisher, the opportunity to pass that 13th Amendment would never have happened. And you would never have that conclusion that Lincoln so wanted to find. Most of the fighting would not have had that arrangement. By mid-February, with the fall of Wilmington, the port, you actually have about 100 days after that, you actually have the surrender of Lee, you have the surrender of Johnston. All the Confederate armies east of the Mississippi River are no more. And thereby the war really comes to an end because there's no more supplies getting into the Confederacy. All these massive ships that they had built, all this stuff that they had done comes for nothing after January 1865. Now, one of the more interesting thing, again, your Medal of Honor recipients, as I mentioned, William Freeman, who's on the left of your screen, he had a very interesting job prior to the war. He was a machinery manufacturer. He actually repaired machinery parts. But after the war, he never is able to recover his pre-war life. Today, we would probably say that he had post-traumatic stress disorder. He was in the worst of the fighting at Fort Fisher. He is actually watching people get blown to bits around him. He is there when the magazine explosion gets blown up, and he's there to recover men who have been buried in 10 feet of sand, who are just crushed. So mentally, he's not the same after the war. He never is able to recover his life. By the end of his life, which was just within the first few years of the turn of the 20th century, he will die from chronic diseases based on all the experiences and that stress that has just never been able to get rid of. Shows what's going on even today with some of our military today with the post-traumatic stress and all that they deal with. For Anderson on the right, again, it takes him, since he can't read or write, he's sitting there in 1890 reading his newspaper. When what does somebody read to him? But the obituary of someone who was a part of that Palisade fence cutting group, who had received his Medal of Honor in 1890. Well, Anderson hearing the story about these guys running and chopping down this fence, and he said, "I was there too. Why didn't I get my Medal of Honor?" And so in 1913, he actually hires an attorney, and he writes letters to the Army saying, "Where's my Medal of Honor? Why did this guy get one and I did not? I did the same exact job." It causes the Army to do an investigation, which is when they find the paperwork. So 50 years after the date, Anderson and 3 other gentlemen are awarded their Medals of Honor for their actions at Fort Fisher, January 15th, 1865. By that time, the other men had all passed away. And at that point, prior to World War I, you had to be alive to receive the Medal of Honor. It was not given to your next of kin. Now, one of the men who actually died of disease, Oscar Kingsland, from one of the New York regiments, is buried in the Wilmington National Cemetery. He is a Medal of Honor nominee. He is technically a recipient, but the Army is not going to give him or donate a Medal of Honor in his honor just because he's not alive to receive it. And they do not want to open up the Civil War record to see if there's any more Medal of Honor recipients that have been missed. Because of Anderson's letter and because of the search for trying to find all these guys, they actually go through and start trying to understand, well, who receives the Medal of Honor? What did they have to do? Anderson's letter comes at a point when the Medal of Honor recipients were asking for stipends from the government, which causes the federal government to start a National Medal of Honor Society. Now, today, if you're going to talk about the Medal of Honor, you call it the Medal of Honor. That's it. It's only when you're talking about the society that controls the medal is when you put congressional in front of it. It's the Congressional Medal of Honor Society. It is the Medal of Honor. It's not the Congressional Medal of Honor. That's the difference. Everybody calls it the Congressional Medal of Honor. It is not. It is just the Medal of Honor. It's the only Medal of Honor that we have in the United States. So, as I was quickly pointed out by a Medal of Honor recipient. So I'm just passing that along. The interesting thing is that Anderson will stay alive for about another 5 to 10 years. He will actually have a descendant of his, interestingly enough, who in 1942 will join the United States Marine Corps. Ambrose Anderson, who is African American, will join the Marine Corps in 1942 as one of the first Marines to be trained for combat duty in the United States Marine Corps, in the United States military. The big interesting thing is that these Mumford Point Marines will actually be sent for combat duty on the island of Iwo Jima in February 1945. Interestingly enough, Ambrose is 99 years old, 98, 99 years old today or this year. He's still alive. And because he's a Mumford Point Marine, all the Mumford Point Marines from 1942 were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal. Now, the Congressional Gold Medal is the highest award that Congress can bestow upon an American citizen. And so, interestingly enough, Bruce Anderson is the recipient of the highest award the United States military can award, the Medal of Honor. And his descendant, Ambrose Anderson, is the recipient of the highest award that a civilian can receive, which is the Congressional Gold Medal. Yes, ma'am. Ms. Brown?
Was Ambrose Anderson his son, his grandson?
Grandson. He's his grandson.
Oh, okay.
Yes, ma'am.
That was his grandson. Okay.
Yes, ma'am. And it's pretty unique. You don't normally hear about Medal of Honor recipient in a congressional. So it's one of the nice things. I actually met Ambrose, let's see, 6 years ago. Very nice gentleman. He's very down to earth. I would never have guessed all the stuff he had to go through in combat. Just a very, very wonderful person. I feel very honored to have gotten to meet him. But his is one of those more unique stories. Now, the Anderson family had allowed us to host Bruce Anderson's Medal of Honor here for about 4 or 5 years. And we're hoping that at some point they'll allow us to put it back on display for the family and show it. But as I mentioned before, this is the only known photograph of Bruce Anderson from that time period. And this is around 1915. We don't have anything before that. He never learned how to read and write English till his dying day. He is buried in somewhere outside of Albany, New York, in the central part of the state of New York. But it's pretty interesting. In that same cemetery is also one of the Medal of Honor recipients from the Fort Fisher Palisade attack, the gentleman who passed away where he read or heard about in the newspaper that this gentleman had passed. So it's kind of unique that they both are there together. Okay. Now, are there any other questions? That was pretty much my presentation, just to sort of give you the reason why Fort Fisher was so important and what it means to the community, to the nation, and internationally. Yes, ma'am. Ms. Bowden? Oh.
The nationality of Bruce Anderson.
I haven't found any records where he got naturalized, but I think he did. So he would be, yeah, he would be an American after the.
My question is, in the beginning, you said he was
born in Mexico City.
Okay.
He didn't know
he
what
would have
nationality.
been he would have been a Mexican citizen. Now, in the 1840s and 50s in Mexico, slavery was not legal. So when he was born a free man. So it wouldn't be, that's when he came to the United States, he would have been a free man to get a job. The only problem was he only spoke Spanish for most of his life. Very broken English after the war.
Okay.
Let me ask this. His son, Ambrose Anderson.
Yes, ma'am.
What kind of language did he speak?
Oh, he was full American.
English?
He spoke English, still does.
Okay.
He was, by the time Bruce passes away, the family is very Americanized. So they are very well respected in their community. They are doing a lot for their community. While Bruce Anderson really never is able to overcome his growing up. He does pick up the language. He's just never very proficient with it. The rest of the family, being born in mid to upstate New York, really picks up.
What nationality of woman did he marry? Did he marry a black woman or Mexican or a white woman or what? I think he's frozen.
But I wanted to know the answer to that too, Gwen.
I
Yes.
think he's frozen.
It looks like it. Give him a second, maybe internet will refresh for him.
You muted. He's muted.
Okay, can y'all hear me now?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
sorry about that. I lost my internet connection for a while. Anderson, it just really shows how much the family
What
really
happened?
said what was going on. Now, in 1942, you got to remember there's a disagreement in the African American community about do we join the war effort? And so for Anderson to join up with the Marine Corps was a pretty big thing. In 1942, you actually have the creation of the Double V campaign in the African American community, which is victory overseas and victory at home. And so that's one of the things that really comes to play in Bruce Anderson's life. He wants to not only do what he can overseas, but he also wants to bring it home and have victory for his people, for the African American community.
Is Ambrose?
Okay, what nationality a woman did Bruce Anderson marry? Did he marry a black lady, Mexican or white lady?
His first wife was a white lady, and then he divorces her and marries a African American. Some point around the turn of the 20th century, around between 1890 and 1900, he marries a black white woman who's his second wife, and that's where Ambrose comes from, is from his second wife. Now, the interesting—
So Ambrose is black.
Right. So the interesting thing is both sides of the Anderson family, the white wife and the black wife, they became best of friends, and they still have family outings together. So it didn't matter.
Great.
So, which is kind of unique. His is a unique story.
Yes, it is. I enjoyed it. Very good, Mr.
I really
Mosley.
did too.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yes, yes.
Thank y'all very much. And hopefully I'll be able to see y'all around again some point soon. And we'll come up with some more interesting topics for you.
Thank you so much, John. It's always a pleasure having you. We appreciate your time.
Hey, not a problem. Glad to do it. Thank you very much for having me.